In addition to there being individual elements and atoms that are essential for life, there are also special molecules essential for life. We've already talked about the fact that if two atoms have incomplete electron shells, orbitals that are unfilled, those theater seats that are unfilled, they like getting together and sharing electrons. And when they do so, they create these bonds that hold those atoms together. When they share electrons, they're called covalent bonds. These are the strongest of the different kinds of bonds that are found between atoms. So as we've already referred to, two hydrogen atoms get together, share the two electrons that they have. They form a covalent, very strong covalent bond between them. And two oxygen atoms get together, they share the electrons that they have and fill their outer shells and create a covalent bond between them that is very strong. Nitrogen actually gets together in sets of three atoms to produce a very strong double covalent bond between them. There are other ways in which atoms interact with atoms, are attracted to each other with slightly weaker bonds. The next weakest bond is called an ionic bond. And this is where rather than two atoms sharing electrons between them, the one atom is strong enough to pull an electron off of the other, keep it for itself. That then leaves one atom short one electron, so it gives it a positive charge. The other atom has an extra electron, giving it a negative charge. Now the two ions are attracted to each other merely because they have different charges. That attraction between two oppositely charged ions, is an ionic bond. It's not as strong as the bond of sharing electrons, the covalent bond, but the ionic bond is nonetheless capable of holding atoms together. The most common example of this would be sodium chloride. Sodium is willing to give up its electron to chlorine, leaving chlorine negative, sodium positive. They're drawn together to produce something we call table salt. They're held together by an ionic bond. There's a third type of bond that is the weakest of all the bonds. In this particular case, it's usually in the situation of a covalent bond where two atoms are in fact sharing electrons, but one of the atoms may be strong enough in what we call electronegativity. It's attracting electrons so powerfully that as the electrons are shared between the two atoms, the electrons spend much more time around one atom than the other, simply because it's got a stronger attraction to the electron. In this case, even though there is a very strong bond holding the two together, the whole combination now has a slightly negative charge on one side of the molecule and a slightly positive charge on the other side. The side that the electron spends more time at has not a full -1 charge, it's got a partial negative charge, but the other side of the molecule has a partial positive charge because the electron just doesn't spend much time over there. This gives the whole molecule a charge that then attracts it to other molecules. The attraction isn't as strong as an ionic bond because it doesn't have a full charge, but it's enough to hold molecules together, at least to some extent. The classic example of this is in fact the water molecule. We've already talked about the fact that oxygen would like to have two electrons in its outer shell, and so it's willing to share the electrons from two hydrogens and thus fill the outer shell of the hydrogens and fill the outer shell or orbital of the oxygen. But the oxygen, and here's a representation of that, the oxygen molecule, oxygen atom is substantially larger than the hydrogen atom. And the hydrogens are held onto the oxygen at this kind of angle, a little over 107 degrees or so between the two. Kind of looks like maybe a Mickey Mouse looking at you there, little ears on the oxygen atom. In this process, the oxygen also is so electronegatively charged that it holds the electron as it's shared going among the three atoms. It spends much more time around the oxygen atom. As a result, this end of the molecule is negatively charged, just a little bit, not a full negative charge, but a partial negative charge. The other side, with the hydrogen atoms on it, is a partial positive charge. This means two water molecules are attracted to each other. One water molecule, the negative side, the oxygen side, is attracted to the hydrogen side of another water molecule, and they stick together. This stickiness between water molecules gives water a most amazing set of characteristics. And we're going to go through a number of those characteristics here to examine the really cool nature of water. First of all, water is a good polar solvent. And what this means is that water is able to dissolve polar substances very readily. What's a polar solvent and what's a polar substance? A polar substance is one that has charges. The water molecule, for example, has slight charges on one end of the other, so it is a polar substance. An ionic substance, one that actually has a full negative or positive charge, is a polar substance. Water is an extraordinary substance to dissolve or hold into suspension any molecule that is polar, any molecule that has charges. So let's say we have a molecule here, it doesn't matter what the shape is, pretty big thing. It would normally, because of its size, be too heavy to be held in suspension in water, but because of water's unique characteristics, it can be held in place. Because let's say this big molecule, whatever it is, has a slight positive charge. If it does, then water molecules will in fact be attracted to that positive charge, namely the negative end of the water molecule will be attracted to that positive charge. They'll gather around the larger molecule in the water, and then water molecules will be attracted to the water molecules that are attached to the large molecule, namely their positive ends, and that will hold the molecule in the water. Just like the water molecules are sticky relative to one another, any polar substance gets a bunch of water molecules stuck to it, and those water molecules will be sticky with other water molecules and hold up pretty heavy molecules in water. This gives water the ability to dissolve very large molecules as long as they're polar. As long as they have some sort of charge, and the stronger the charge, the easier it is to hold it up in water. This gives water the ability to dissolve all sorts of cool things. As a result, if you're in a stream or a pond, you're in water, but because water's ability to dissolve polar molecules, there isn't just water there. There's all sorts of things held in suspension, dissolved in the water, that are essential for life. Many of the things that we consider nutrients turn out to be molecules that are polar and can be held in suspension by water. So the streams and the ponds and the lakes and the oceans, they're full of nutrients essential for life. Makes water a great substance on this planet to support life. In addition, organisms use water inside their bodies to dissolve and carry and move molecules from one place to another. So for example, animals often have blood that is basically water with all sorts of things dissolved in it. In fact, blood often has so many things dissolved in it that it's a rather thick liquid as a result of that. But this allows, and then when an animal can pump that blood around through the body, the blood carries then all sorts of things that are needed by the cells of the body. Nutrients, again, that have electrical charges can be carried to cells, and waste products of the cells that have electric charges can be carried in water out of the body. And even in plants, we have sap. We have water that goes up and down the length of the plant, carrying nutrients and food particles throughout the plant. Again, that amazing characteristic of stickiness of water allows water to supply the needs of organisms. Then when you even look a little closer at the cells of organisms, you find that inside cells, they are full of water. And they hold all their substances in the cell and all the nutrients in the cell, and even oxygen and that sort of thing, in suspension in water. It's held in place because of water's amazing solvent characteristics. In addition to being a fantastic polar solvent, water also has what we call a high specific heat. Specific heat is the amount of energy necessary to heat up a substance. If you have, and technically, the way we define it in science is if you have 1 gram of a substance, the specific heat is how much heat it takes to raise the temperature of that 1 gram of substance 1 degree centigrade. So some substances heat up very readily. It doesn't take much heat to increase their temperature. A piece of iron actually heats up rather rapidly because it has a very low specific heat. Doesn't take much heat to raise the temperature of iron. You can see this if you put an empty pot, metal pot, on the stove, turn on the burner, and rather quickly, if it doesn't have an insulated handle, you're feeling the heat of the pot because it quickly goes into the iron, heats up the iron, and heats it up very rapidly because it's got a low specific heat. If you pour some water in that container, however, you will realize that it takes a whole lot longer to heat up the water. That's because water has an extremely high specific heat. In fact, it's somewhere around 1,000 times the specific heat of iron. In fact, water has one of the highest specific heats of any substance that we know of. And why is that? Well, because the molecules are sticky, because they hold together with one another because of their electrical charges, and because temperature turns out to be due to how much molecules are vibrating. So the more a molecule is vibrating, the warmer the substance is. The more a molecule is still, the cooler the substance is. So it's something we call absolute zero, absolutely cold. The molecules are completely still. They're not moving at all. At extremely high temperatures, they're vibrating quite rigorously. Given that, if you have water molecules that are stuck together, in order to get one water molecule to vibrate, you've got to get every water molecule to vibrate that's attached to it. It's much easier to get independent molecules to heat up because you can get one molecule to vibrate, then move the next one, get that one to vibrate. You can heat things up much more quickly, much more readily if they're not attached to one another. But water molecules are stuck together, so you can't move one without moving all of the others. It takes a tremendous amount of heat to increase the temperature of water. This turns out to be a very useful characteristic, and I would say an essential characteristic for life itself. Since 70% of the earth is covered by water, it's got oceans. Not only is there a surface of water, but the oceans are very deep. There's a huge amount of water on the surface of this earth. Once you have heated up the oceans with sunlight or whatever, those oceans function as a storehouse of heat. It takes a huge amount of heat to heat them up. They have to lose a tremendous amount of heat to cool down. This means that as the Earth turns in space, land, the continents, have a very low specific heat. They cool very rapidly into space. You can cool by radiating heat outward. So when night comes and the land is faced away from the sun, it very quickly cools into space. If there's no water, it would cool very rapidly. The Earth would basically be frozen by the end of the night, and it'd have to heat up again during the day. And you might have noticed this if you've ever lived or visited the desert. In the desert, a good, very dry desert, you'll have very hot temperatures during the day as the sun is beating down on you and heating you. But when the sun goes down, very quickly the temperature drops and will get below freezing very quickly because there's no water in the soil to hold the heat. The low specific heat of sand and rock and that sort of thing of the desert is quickly cooled by radiation into space, and things cool down rapidly. In contrast, if you're in a tropical or semi-tropical place with lots of water in the soil, as long as the sun is beating down upon it, of course, it stays warm. When the Earth turns in such a way that the sun is no longer shining on it, the high specific heat of water holds heat for a long period of time. It holds a lot of heat, so it takes a long time for it to cool. By the time the end of the night comes around, the water is still holding heat. So the temperature drop at night is usually in the tropics only about 1 degree, sometimes 2 degrees centigrade. A very small amount because of the extremely high specific heat of water. The effect of this is that because we have so much water on the surface of the Earth, so many oceans on the Earth, the rotation of the Earth, even though that does point the Earth for half the time away from the sun and it's cooling while that's happening, because there's so much water, the temperature on the Earth doesn't change a lot from day to night, and it allows the Earth to be warm enough for organisms to live. Another effect of this is that if you've ever visited the shore of an extremely large lake, like one of the Great Lakes of the U.S., or one of the shores along the shore of the ocean, you'll notice that the temperature along the ocean is different than it is further inland. You get 10 miles inland, and you'll find that the temperature in the summer near a body of water is something on the order of 10 degrees cooler near the water than it is away from the water. Because it takes a long time for, let's say, the summer heat to heat up the water, and so the water remains cooler for longer. Then when fall comes around and winter comes around and it's cooling the land very effectively, very quickly, it takes a long time for the water to cool down. You might have noticed this early in the season for swimming pools. They're cold, and then the swimming pools remain warm into the fall. And that's because of this high specific heat of water. It actually kind of moderates the temperatures along shorelines. 10 degrees cooler in the summer, 10 degrees warmer in the winter, making what a lot of people prefer the climate along large bodies of water for that reason. A third characteristic of water that's essential for life is what's called the high heat of vaporization. In this particular instance, we're talking about the heat that it takes to boil water, to transfer water from a liquid state to a gaseous state. Again, the reason, and the high heat of vaporization, the heat of vaporization is the amount of heat it takes to cause a substance that's already at the right temperature to boil, to actually boil. You can raise the temperature of water all the way up to its boiling point, 100 degrees centigrade, 212 degrees Fahrenheit. But at the point that you reach that temperature, it's not going to boil yet unless you put some additional heat into it to cause the individual molecules to leap out of the fluid and go into the atmosphere as a gas. In the case of water, because the water molecules are stuck to each other, once you get to the right temperature, it still takes a huge amount of heat to get them to let go of their neighbors and be yanked into the atmosphere to become a gas. As a result, once you get to the boiling point of water, you have to put a tremendous amount of heat into it, additional heat into it, to actually get it to boil. So interestingly enough, ironically enough, even though the temperature of boiling water is the same as the temperature of the steam that comes off of it, the steam actually contains more heat than the water does. And you can get burnt more from the steam than you can get burnt from the water because of that additional amount of heat that goes into it to cause it to evaporate. Because of the stickiness of water, the heat of vaporization of water is huge. Again, it is greater than almost every substance that we know of. And so as a result of this, there's a whole sequence of things that come out as a result of this. You can use water, for example, to air condition things. And organisms do that. For example, we might sweat when it gets hot. And what's involved there? Well, we exude water on the surface of our skin. And then in order for that water to evaporate, it needs to absorb or pick up a tremendous amount of heat. The high heat of vaporization means water pulls in a huge amount of heat. Well, it can take that heat from your skin, thus cooling your skin. Take some of it from the atmosphere, but some of it from your skin. Thus, the process of evaporating water, which is sweat, will in fact cool you down. Bees will use this, honeybees will use this by taking water. They don't drink water, but you'll often find them collecting water. What are they doing that for? They will take the water back to the hive and use it for air conditioning purposes. The brood, the young honeybees, require a temperature range which is actually rather narrow. If it gets too cold, the little baby bees will die. If it gets too hot, the little baby bees will die. So the temperature of the hive has to be kept at a certain narrow range. If it gets too cold, the bees gather around, eat a bunch of honey, and vibrate, warming the area and thus warming the hive. If it gets too hot, the bees will go collect water, come back and spread the water on the combs, on the wax of the hive, and then they will stand in lines, one line facing into the hive, another line facing out of the hive, and hold on to the ground there and beat their wings and cause air to circulate into the hive, through the hive, and out of the hive. The air then picks up, evaporates the water that's been spread on the combs, thus cooling the combs. Because again, in order to evaporate, that water needs additional heat. That heat comes out of the combs, comes out of the air that the bees are circulating through it. So it turns out to be essential for many organisms that water has this amazing characteristic of an extremely high heat of vaporization. Another characteristic of water that is somewhat unique to water is its high surface tension. In this particular case, the reason we have this again is because of the stickiness of water. The individual water molecules are holding together with each other, so the surface of the water is tough. There's a surface tension there that makes it slightly difficult to puncture the surface of the water. You've seen this probably in a variety of ways. Let's see. One is that water comes down out of clouds in droplets. Why does it do that? Why does it accumulate in these droplets? It's because water molecules are attracted to each other and they form a glob that holds together, and it's got a surface tension there. So if you were a little guy, let's say you were the size of a honeybee, and you get hit with a drop of water, That thing holds together because of surface tension and could hit you really hard and knock you right out of the sky, which is why honeybees don't fly around in the rain. Also, I like when I'm, let's say, driving a car, I'm somewhat distracted sometimes in a rainstorm by what the water droplets are doing on the windshield. I think it's really cool that you see these beads or droplets of water held together because of the stickiness of water that move up the windshield because of the wind that's caused by you moving forward. When two droplets come close together, and you can tell they're moving together because of the wind. Then when they get really close, they quickly accelerate and unite. And the reason they're drawn to each other is because the water molecules have charges. So the droplets of water are drawn to each other, merge, and become one droplet, held together again by that high surface tension. Organisms, and there's another illustration of this, one I never liked as a kid. There's this medicine liquid medicine that I had to take from time to time. Typically tastes terrible. And I remember my mother having a spoon and then pouring the medicine there into the spoon. And I hated this particular characteristic of water, this high surface tension of water, because I wanted as little medicine in that spoon as possible. But as she poured the water into the spoon, it's a liquid with things dissolved in it, it would go past the edge of the spoon and actually pool up higher than the edge of the spoon. It's like, no. And the reason it could go higher and hold in there before it finally fell out was because of this high surface tension of water. Organisms take advantage of that. There are certain organisms that actually can walk on the surface of water because of that surface tension. Water striders are designed with special designs to their feet that they can walk on the top of water, run on the top of water. They live on the top of water. Other organisms take advantage of it in different ways. For example, the bird's nest fungus produces a bird's nest shape structure that's very small. It's about the size of the end of your finger or so. It creates a cup that has 4 very large spores in it. And it's designed in such a way that a water droplet drops down, hits the edge of the cup, and curls in the cup and kicks the spores out. In fact, a little tiny cup like that will kick spores 3 to 4 feet away from the cup. It's taking advantage of the surface tension of the water droplets to spread the spores in that fashion. Another characteristic of water is its capillary action. Because again, water is sticky, it's holding on to other water molecules, and it will hold on to the surfaces of some things. It'll stick onto the walls of objects, let's say plastic straw. If you have water in a straw, if you ever noticed that, stick the straw in your drink and look at the water in the straw, you'll notice that the water has been drawn up into the straw a little bit higher than the level of the water in the cup. And not only that, but along the very edges of the straw, if you look carefully, it'll be drawn a little bit higher along the edges of the straw than it is in the middle of the straw, creating either a U-shaped or a flat U-shaped surface. And what it is the water molecules are creeping up the side of the wall of that straw because they're attracted to the charged particles in the plastic of the straw. Likewise, along the cup, if you look carefully, the water curves upward along the edge of the cup. And this is called capillary action, where it creeps up the side of things. And you'll notice that if you have different sized straws, let's say you have 8 different size straws made of the same substance in a cup of water. The large straw, you will notice that the water comes up a short distance above the level of the water in the cup. But the narrower the diameter of the straw, the higher the water comes up into the straw. This is called capillary action. If you get a small enough diameter straw, the water will actually rise up inches above the level of the cup. In fact, if you get a microscopically small straw, you can draw the water up nearly a foot. In fact, some cases you can, depending on the substance you make the straw of, you can draw it up even as much as 2 feet up into the straw. This is what we call capillary action. This is how plants get water from their roots up to their leaves. The small plants in particular can use just capillary action alone to get the water from the roots to the leaves. If they have little tubes, we're going to see this in a lab in the future here, they have tiny little tubes, tubular-shaped cells that are emptied out as the cell develops, allowing water to go up through the straw all the way to the leaves. The plant doesn't have to pump the water to the leaves. They take advantage of this extraordinary capillary action to get water to the photosynthetic areas. Another characteristic of water, a very unique characteristic of water that is, as far as I know, known by no other substance in the universe, is that water expands very close to the freezing point of water. Now, let me explain what's going on and why this is weird. Most substances, as you cool the substance, it'll shrink in volume. It will increase in density. As you heat any substance, it will expand. So as you take, let's say, water and add heat to it and watch it through time, it will gradually occupy more and more volume as the temperature goes up. Most substances do this uniformly. You can start when they're, let's say, solid, they're frozen, and you heat them up, and the frozen material expands, and then it melts, expands quite a bit at that point, and then it continues to expand as the temperature increases. Then it evaporates, that will expand a whole lot more, but it continues to expand as you heat it when it's a gas. Most substances, for their entire known temperature range, as you heat it up, it expands. As you cool it, it contracts. And there's only, well, I don't know how many total molecules do this, but it's probably less than a half a dozen molecules have a very strange characteristic that for most of the temperature range, it does what everything else does. It increases in volume as it's heated up. It decreases in volume as it cools. But at short intervals, somewhere along its temperature range, some substances will actually, rather than continue to expand, will for a short period of their temperature range contract. They will shrink and then go back to heating up again as you continue to heat it. In the case of water, water is one of those few substances that has that little kink in the heating or cooling curve where it shrinks for a while it's heated before it goes back to expanding again. In the case of water, that little kink is down very close to the freezing point of water. So as you take, let's say, really, really cold ice, and you heat it up, it will expand, expand. Then it'll melt and expand quite a bit. But then, as you continue to heat it, there's a period where, in fact, it will shrink quite a bit. And then it will expand again all the way through the rest of the temperature range of water. The effect of this is that as you cool water, go the other way, there's an expansion that occurs at freezing, which is due to this really weird temperature effect, so that water ice actually floats on water, which is really bizarre. No other substance, as you freeze it, has the ice float. If you take iron, let's say you got molten iron, and you cool it As ice forms, solid iron forms, in order to freeze iron, it shrinks, and so it's more dense, and so it sinks. So if you have molten iron and cool it, it will freeze from the bottom of the molten chunk of iron to the top, if you're cooling it at the top. In the case of water, however, when it freezes, the ice, rather than sinking like every other substance in the universe, it floats. And as a result, you get this strange thing of water ice forms on the top of lakes and doesn't sink to the bottom, which it usually would. If water was like anything else, you would freeze your water at the surface, the ice would drop to the bottom and freeze the lakes and the rivers from the bottom up, and we wouldn't have fish in streams, we wouldn't have fish in lakes. It would be catastrophe. The entire earth would basically probably freeze from the bottom of water bodies to the top, and we wouldn't have life in the water. So it's this very strange characteristic of water that it actually expands upon freezing that allows life to exist on this planet. Water is truly a unique molecule that is absolutely essential for life. If it didn't have all these weird, bizarre characteristics, life would not be possible. So the existence of water, a very special molecule in the universe, allows life to exist. But there are other molecules that are similarly very important, essential for life. Carbon dioxide, carbonic acid, ammonia, phosphoric acid, and a bunch of others have unique characteristics, arguably maybe not quite as wild and crazy as water, but nonetheless essential for life. If it were not for these molecules, life would not be possible on this planet or in this universe. It is these kind of water molecules are another example of the anthropic principle, evidence that suggests that the universe looks like it was created for human beings and or life in general, human beings in particular.